Hey there, everybody. It's Steve, and the date today is March 28th, 2021. And, of course, it's a new day, new video, but this one's going to be a little bit different than my, the kind of standard format that I'm using for this series that I'm doing. And about 2 months ago, I recorded what was going to be sort of a mock podcast thing that I was going to post on my Patreon, and it just never happened. And it was in relation to a video that I did about a mysterious incident that happened in 1911. And in fact, it was discovered, first reported on in newspapers, March 28th, 1911. So 110 years ago today. And this case involved the discovery of a young woman that had apparently been brutally murdered. However, over the course of, the next 48 hours or so, this apparent murder by blunt force trauma to the head turned into a suicide by gun. And I was really bothered by that, especially knowing what I know about how the police in Portland, where this case happened, were back then. And I produced about a 27-minute long video on my other channel, Steve the Amateur Historian. So if you want to go see me go to the actual location where these events happen and delve into the case and some of the points that have bothered me about this, I'll leave that link in the description below, along with, of course, my link to my Patreon page if you want to become a patron. Help me out that way. I'm always posting more stuff there, giving you literal bang for your buck. And also the links, while I'm talking about it, to my Instagram and Facebook pages closely related to the content that I'm doing here, as well as my Steve the Amateur Historian page, will also be included. So if you want to get an introduction on this case, you can see that video. This particular recording I did, though, it's a little less than an hour long, and again, I was going to post it on my Patreon, never did, and it was me kind of doing kind of a free thinking reflection on the case again after having done my YouTube video on it on my other channel. And in this thing, I go a lot more deeper into what I feel about the case and why I feel like there was something sketchy going on, and that I honestly think that a certain murder case was deemed probably one that the police weren't going to solve, and so they meshed it with another case, which may or may not have happened. I think it probably did happen because they interviewed family members, but I think they took two completely different cases and pushed them together. And in this video, I'm going to play that recording for you. So it's going to be this kind of in-depth, just kind of me going over all the details of the case and analyzing it and explaining why I feel like there's just a lot of things wrong with this case. So all that said, let's get to today's video. The video just went live recently. I was actually very happy with the feedback I was getting from people, because I felt like some people might come on and think that, like, this video was just me trying to create something that wasn't there, because it is very possible and I understand this entirely, for newspapers to get details wrong. So maybe they just got a few details wrong, and this person that they thought was a murder victim ended up being actually a case of suicide. But the thing is, like, almost all of the details were different. All right? It's one thing if you mistake a person's last name, or you say they were found, 46th in Fremont when it was really 47th in Fremont. A detail here or there, things that are understandable to miss, but the details of the thing completely changed within a 48-hour period. That's what really bothered me the most. Now, the Portland Police Department was corrupt as hell during this time. They were, this is 1911. Absolutely corrupt, and if they wanted to cover something up, they would do it. I studied, these earlier years, these early 1900s years of the Portland police, for a few different videos, specifically for my Woman in the Water documentary, because I think the police were directly involved in the killing of that woman, especially if it was Anna Schrader. But yeah, I dove deep into that stuff, into all the corruption that the police were involved in. And it's not like it's Portland specific to back in the good old days. If you didn't have a real suspect in a serious murder case, you got whoever, fit the bill. Case in point, a guy named William Hirons went to prison. He was like one of America's longest serving prison inmates, because he went to prison when he was like 17 or something. He was the guy that was convicted of being the lipstick killer in Chicago, who killed three people, 2 women and a little girl. He got beat up. He essentially claimed that, he said later on that he only admitted to doing it because, he knew they were going to blame him anyway, and as long as he pled to it, he would be able to get life in prison. And in that vein, he would be able to at least try to fight it from in prison. That, a lot of people say without a doubt he's the killer. I think this is my personal opinion, don't have to agree with me, but I personally think William Hirons wasn't the lipstick killer. But I think he was a convenient fall guy. He was a young teenager with a history of petty crime. I think he even had a slight history of violence, fighting with people and stuff. But I don't think he was the guy. I think he was a convenient case, and, they took him in, they beat him up, they did all kinds of stuff to him before he finally, admitted to it. Stuff like that happened, in the case of the Black Dahlia, people admitted to it because the police would bring them in and beat the shit out of them and say, admit it that you did it. And then we'd find out that they didn't do it either. It happens all the time. I mean, I'm sure it still happens, but it was much more commonplace because it was a lot less understood that was really going along. The public just went along with anything you said. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was a German immigrant who ultimately was executed for the abduction of Charles Lindbergh's baby, I don't think did that either. But he was a convenient target. He was a foreigner from Germany. That was kind of the attitude was, well, a true, full-blooded American would never do something so disgusting as do something like this to the iconic Lindbergh family. But literally, the guy had witnesses. He had evidence that he was not anywhere near that area when the kidnapping happened. And, it was found out that the police manufactured evidence, that they manipulated witnesses. But there was so much, ill will from the public. The guy went down for it. And I get the feeling that something kind of along, obviously not as big of a case, but I think something along those lines kind of happened. Because who they said, the details they had about this murder victim, which I still think it was a murder victim, out of the gate was astronomically different from what they had 48 hours later. The initial report is they found this woman, her skull was fractured. It was already being assumed that she was likely killed as a result of severe blunt force trauma to the head. She was dressed in a very refined manner, like she came from a well-to-do family. And she had just been found, in the brush. And it's interesting, they say that she likely was deposited there sometime in the night, but then she's not found until, mid-afternoon the next day. And, she was, in the bushes, kind of. That was another detail, was that, it looked like someone had done kind of a haphazard effort in hiding the body. She was somewhat secluded in some brush, which it seems kind of strange that a suicide victim would have the appearance, after they shoot themselves dead, that they would have the appearance that they tried to hide their body. How would you even pull that off? I mean, I guess you could stand right in front of the bushes, do the act and then fall into them, but still you're not going to really have much control over how much you seclude yourself. So that was another thing, is when the body was found, I think it was only that her feet were sticking out from under the bushes that led to her being found, which I still feel if someone's feet are sticking out from under a bush, someone should have seen her much sooner than mid-afternoon. And I just, that was another thing. They said that the woman was, it looked like she had been hurriedly stashed there by someone. Someone killed her somewhere else, quickly drove her, or I guess it was 1911, they probably didn't have a car, but some manner delivered her to that scene, and, didn't want to get seen. Maybe they, even if it was the middle of the night when her body was left there, maybe they heard something or saw someone coming, so they quickly had to just kind of ditch her in the bushes and bail. That was the absolute vibe given. Those are the details given by the police, and everybody was of the opinion out of the gate that this young woman was killed elsewhere. They even had a theory going that, they felt like whoever this young woman was, she'd probably been lured to a certain location and then murdered for whatever means. They couldn't know the details of that. And of course they didn't have an identification of her right out of the gate. She was just this young woman. They described her, some said she was maybe as young as 15, but most said she was more about 16 to 17 years old. So she looked generally like, sophomore or a junior in high school age, if that kind of helps give a vibe for how this young woman's appearance was. And she had just apparently had her head caved in. They said, she had skull fractures. The first newspaper report on this case, that was their description, was that her skull had been fractured, likely with a blunt instrument, and that's probably what killed her. And she was dressed in a very refined manner. Again, she came from a well-to-do family, and I almost wonder, did the police find this body and immediately know who she was? Because she may have been the prominent daughter of a local family. Now, the issue with that is if this was, say, the daughter of some prominent local, I don't know, businessman, banker, whatever. Well, there would have been some, even if the police just kind of hid this away, which I feel like they wouldn't. I feel like they would probably still tell the family, but still try, or they might even not tell the family because they would realize pretty quickly, we have no clue who did this, and we're going to get in a lot of trouble socially if we're considered the, Keystone Cops that couldn't figure out who killed such and such important son of a bitch guy's daughter. That's entirely possible, but I feel like if this really was somebody from a prominent family, something would have come out, because she would have at least been reported missing. And every bit as much in newspapers back in the day as is the case today. If you were someone of importance, you were someone who was affluent, of influence, if anything out of the norm happened to your family, it got reported in the newspaper back during this time. So if this was some prominent person's daughter and the police covered it up, they would have to report it, because people would have seen, people would see the body, hear about the body, see the police reporting to the scene. The police would have to admit that they found a body. So it ends up in the newspaper articles, but it's this young unidentified person. I still feel like, if that was the case, her family would have reported her missing, and that would have shown up somewhere. So again, I don't really know the circumstances now. It was a young person, and it seemed like, out of the gate, the police seemed to have their hands tied. They really didn't have a clue who would have done this, who could have done this. They didn't even have an identity yet for this young person. But again, the reports, the attitude of the police at the time was, we have about a 15 to 17-year-old young woman who was likely, beaten to death with some kind of blunt instrument, skull fractures, dressed nice, left in some bushes in a somewhat secluded manner near the intersection of 47th and Fremont. That was the that was the story as far as authorities knew it in the first, several hours after the girl was discovered and the investigation began. And I might butcher the girl's name, but it was Suzanne Queering, I believe was the young girl's name. So, roughly 2 days later, suddenly it's reported that this body that was found, skull fractured with a blunt instrument, was actually a suicide victim, and it was a 12-year-old girl named Suzanne Queering. 12 years old. So essentially, we're supposed to believe that a girl who was about the age of a 6th grader was confused for a girl who was more like a 10th or 11th grader. I mean, when you put it that way, it's a little hard to believe. I'm horrible at guessing people's ages. You could be 27, I could guess you're 34. You could be 33, I could guess you're 25. I personally confuse people, because I still look a lot younger than I am. I just turned 35. And as I mentioned in my live stream a little while back, this guy that gave me a bunch of crap about my Vegas video, he referred to me as a 25-year-old narrator. So even though he was insulting me, he thought I was 10 years younger than I actually am. Or I guess 9 years, because I did that video a little over a year ago. I just dabbed. So again, I'm a very bad judge of age. But in this case, it's their job to make these estimates and things like that. The police specifically said and reported this girl looked like she was about 15, 16, 17 years old. And now suddenly she's a 12-year-old. Maybe Suzanne Queering was a very mature-looking 12-year-old, but still, even a mature-looking 12-year-old is still not going to really look like... They might pull off 14 on a good day. They're not going to pull off 17. They're just not. Even I could make that distinction. That was one of the first things that bothered me, was this age discrepancy. Had Suzanne Queering been 14 and they confused her for 15, 16, 17, there's some wiggle room there. That's understandable. But 12, that bothered me. But what bothered me the most is the cause of the crime had to change. Again, they said her skull was fractured from being beaten. Well, no one's going to commit suicide that way. So after, the very first newspaper article I read on the case said nothing about anything other than blunt force trauma to the head, skull fracture. Well, suddenly, the story shifts and the Rose City Park victim has a hole in her head caused by a gun. And she apparently is found with the gun in her hand and 2 bullets in her pocket. So suddenly this Rose City Park, this unknown Rose City Park victim suddenly became this 12-year-old suicide victim named Suzanne Queering. And they said as much in their newspaper reports, because they would say the young woman found dead in Rose City Park a couple of days ago was identified as Suzanne. So obviously you could connect the dots and realize that the authorities were saying these were the same people, despite the age difference and despite the fact that there were no reports in the first 24 hours of any gun, any bullets, any violence due to gunfire. How could the police miss the earliest reports? How could they miss a hole in the head that would be bleeding out, or at least would have been bleeding out? How would you miss that? How would you go around saying, okay, well, it's a murder investigation, and they already had this theory that this girl was lured away somewhere. It was a murder case. Murder. And yet apparently she was found with the gun in her hand. How do you not immediately just assume, you still investigate, but why would you not immediately think that's a suicide? If there's a hole in the person's, or at least a murder staged as a suicide. The concept of suicide was never brought up, at the start. But how do you find a victim with a hole in their head, a gun in their hand, and a couple bullets in their pocket? No mention of if there was bullets still in the chamber. How do you see that and say, oh, this is a murder case, definitively? Well, only if those items aren't there. I'm sorry, but when someone is shot in the head and they have the gun in their hand, the obvious initial perspective is going to be this was a suicide. I've seen murders that were substantially less convincing than that they've, authorities have tried to pass off as suicides. In relation to Bill Clinton and his, you really want to be disgusted? I mean, it's going to be hard to find anything about any past president now that we've had Trump that's going to be, everything bad about presidents in the past now is going to be kind of watered down since we've had Trump. But if you think Bill Clinton was a good guy, take a look back at what he was doing during the 80s as a governor in Arkansas. And one of the things was, this is just a brief side note, one of the things is he essentially had this coroner in his hip pocket. And this coroner was known for reaching these absurd conclusions about how people died. And a lot of these people, he would say randomly, died as a result of suicide. Look up the train deaths, 1987. These two boys that lived in Arkansas who, as the story goes, stumbled upon a drug shipment thing because, Arkansas, Bill Clinton helped open up Arkansas to be the primary place in America where cocaine was shipped. Look up Mena, Arkansas, and what was going on there. Anyway, these two teenage boys, Kevin Ives and Don Henry, I believe Don was his first name. Of course I would forget that. They were out hanging out together and they were found later on. They'd been laid on some train tracks and got hit by a train, and the authorities tried to say that they smoked a bunch of weed and passed out and got hit by a train, when reality was they were killed. It was but this guy that Clinton, this coroner that Clinton had in his pocket, he was one of the people that said that these kids died in accidental death. Well, the fact of the matter is they were caught as potential witnesses and they were murdered. And it's known, it was 1987, it's known as the train deaths case. And this coroner determined that a man who had been decapitated died of an ulcer. I mean, and this was a guy that, again, Bill Clinton had in his hip pocket, and he called a lot of murders suicides with no evidence to suggest such. I don't know, I just started thinking about that as an example while I started thinking about murders being made to look like suicide. But in this case, this Rose City victim, it just didn't make any sense. And even if they held that information back, why would they come out and imply that the victim was murdered a different way? If someone was murdered and you don't want to say why, just clam up. You're the police. You can say, I can't answer that. It's an ongoing investigation. But no, they came out and said skull fracture, blunt force trauma, end of story. And now suddenly, it's not just that a bullet hole in the head is added to the story, but that whole thing about blunt force trauma, skull fractures to the woman's head. After that first day, those details disappeared from the story, never to be heard again. Because, it's kind of weird. He was shooting the woman with, whoever did it was shooting the woman with one gun and beating her with some kind of club in the other. So it seemed pretty clear to me that this case was shifted. And whoever this Suzanne, I said Queering, it's Queering. That was her last name. I knew I was going to screw that up. So, considering the fact that Suzanne Queering's, her relatives were spoken to, I think I said in the video I wasn't certain if he'd even seen her body to identify her, to even verify that Suzanne was dead. But I did find that in an article yesterday, one article, not yesterday, but I did find it in one article that stated that he had apparently been shown the body and identified it as Suzanne's body. So, I don't think that the whole Suzanne Queering angle was made up. But I just think the authorities used Suzanne. It was a convenient situation, within like a day, pretty much, Suzanne Queering dies, and they have this unsolved murder case to deal with that involved damage to the head and a teenage victim, more or less. And I think they used the Suzanne Queering situation to try and make the Rose City Park victim disappear. And, they had to quash details when they did that. One of the most damning details about whether they were the same women or not is the Rose City Park victim was found near 47th and Fremont. That was always where that victim was found. That information never changed. Despite different newspaper articles written by different people, it wasn't just the same article being reposted over and over again. It was definitive, it was well-known, verified. This unknown murder victim died in the vicinity of 47th and Fremont. Well, once Suzanne Queering suddenly became that victim, they said that she was murdered like a mile away from there. I think that it said that she killed herself. It was at Knott Street and one of the numbers, so I want to say like 37th. It was a location that was like southwest from where the Rose City murder victim was found. And again, the area where they say Suzanne Queering was found wasn't even in the Rose City Park neighborhood. So how could they say that she's the Rose City Park victim? I think, if you were just north of Fremont at 47th, you weren't there, but Rose City Park neighborhood went right up to that intersection, so you can understand people saying that this is a Rose City Park area. But Suzanne Queering is found like a mile away. So, so I found, a couple more articles I found about Suzanne Quering's suicide. This was only, the location where she was found was only mentioned in one of them. And then it just kind of generally became, this was the victim that was found dead a few days ago. And I'm like, well, how are you getting the locations completely wrong? So there were a lot of issues with this. Nothing matched. The locations they were found didn't match. Their ages didn't match. How they died didn't match. That's kind of significant, don't you think? And then just the fact that the victim supposedly found with the gun on her and with the bullets. Where were those details? Before Suzanne Queering's name came out. And before it, it was reported that, she had committed suicide. And the story, again, I don't doubt. It's sad and it's a very strange story. But the fact that, well, and again, because Suzanne Queering's discovery being dead was, if it's co-opted into this story of this unknown or unnamed Rose City Park murder victim, obviously, how Suzanne Queering was actually discovered would have to be another story. And what was that story? We don't know. We don't know if she's a different person and she's actually found over on like near Knott and 37th or 39th. What were the circumstances in that area and how she was found? We don't know. because obviously she was reported as being this one victim, so there wouldn't be other details, that somebody else found. I mean, the circumstances in which the Rose City murder victim was found were so strange, too. I'll try and get back to that, because now I'm talking about Suzanne Queering. So I have little doubt that Suzanne Queering was what was obviously a real person who probably actually died a tragic death. Again, her relative, who I believe she was living with, did officially identify her body. However, that doesn't mean that the body she was shown was the Rose City Park victim. It just was Suzanne's body. So whether he identified Suzanne or not doesn't really change the issues in this story, because I think Suzanne Queering really died too. But again, the kind of strange story, which in and of itself, it almost made me want to question whether this Suzanne Queering really did die or whether she even existed. The relative that identified her could have just been some plant. That seemed a little bit of a stretch, but the official story was that 12-year-old Suzanne, who I guess took her education very seriously, she apparently was reprimanded at school. No real description as to how much she was reprimanded or what exactly she was reprimanded for, but apparently she'd gotten into a little bit of trouble at school. She was then apparently so ashamed of what she did or so frightened as to how she would be treated after that she apparently took a gun and went off to a spot, near Knott Street, and shot herself in the head, killed herself because she, couldn't stand the humiliation. It just seemed like such a ridiculous story for a girl that seemed to have really no prior issues. I mean, if she was going to go to that extent just because she'd been reprimanded at school, makes me feel like she was probably a pretty good student and probably took her education very seriously. She was probably not a, as they say, troubled youth. But then again, we know so little about this girl. She could have had mental problems. She could have had psychological issues. She could have been a perfectly valid student, but somebody who was deeply troubled. She may have suffered, and this is 1911, if kids had issues like this, they weren't that well understood. They weren't really that well appreciated. And when I say appreciated, I mean people taking them seriously and understanding them for what they are. It's possible Suzanne Queering could have had, mental issues, depression, suicidal thoughts. And, this getting in trouble at school could have been a trigger or a catalyst that finally drove her to just do it. That's entirely possible, and it's totally something that wouldn't really get reported in the news because, again, that kind of thing wasn't really that well understood. And again, this was during the time when people were being sent to insane asylums and special homes and sterilized, a lot of them, so they couldn't procreate. And some of these people, their mental illness was alcoholism, or their mental illness was homosexuality. Or, if you had seizures, even if that's all you just had seizures from time to time, but you didn't really have anything beyond that, you could get sent to one of these places. So, people were either, if they showed signs of something, they were either immediately sent to some home, or on the flip side was families either didn't notice it because they didn't want to notice it, or if they did notice it, they would keep quiet about it because they didn't want anything to happen to their kid. They didn't want to have to be one of those families that sent their kid off to a special place. Because just getting reprimanded for something at school alone in and of itself sounds like a little bit of a stretch for a kid to kill herself. I feel like there had to be other circumstances at play, most likely. And so again, we don't know exactly how Suzanne Queering was discovered. If she wasn't the Rose City victim, and she would have thus been a different person discovered elsewhere. But in the circumstances of the Rose City Park victim, and this was very interesting. I don't know if it really bears anything on the case. It was just interesting, like a lot of the details in this case, as they come, as they go, as they shift. But there was this, and he was never named. The newspapers never named this guy, and I kind of wish they would so I could look up the guy and see if maybe he had a checkered past or something. But there was a construction crew working just a couple blocks down from where the Rose City Park victim was found at 47th and Fremont. And there was this guy that they said, would show up. I guess he was probably kind of a transient, like desperate for work, and he would show up every day trying to get work with them with their construction crew. And they would, rebuke him each time. And they said that, this guy, the guy who discovered the body, he was literally on his way back there to ask again if he could join their construction crew. And it was while this man was on his way there to ask again that he discovered this murder victim sticking out of the bushes. And so he went to the construction site and told them, and one of the guys that worked at the site went there with him to see the body. And so there was actually a lot of confusion. There was a guy named O'Neill that worked on the construction site. And it was some people actually thought he was the one who discovered the body, but really it was this other unnamed guy that kept trying to get work with them. But O'Neill went with him to see the body, and I think O'Neill was the one responsible for actually contacting authorities and telling them what they had found, or what had been found by this other mystery guy. So again, the fact that it was this like kind of, and they described this kind of transient guy as kind of this, he's just kind of a weird guy. It was probably part of the reason they never gave him work. Yeah, they described this guy as just being a little bit of an oddball, a little strange. So it was kind of interesting that, here's this murder victim who, Fremont and 47th isn't downtown, but it's heavily traveled. Even back in 1911, it would have been more open. Fremont's always been kind of a significant street in Portland. There would have been some people in the area walking up and down the street. I just find it so strange, and maybe it was a day where not a lot of people are out. Maybe just nobody, maybe somebody, because, this is a big era for people to see something and then say, it's none of my business, and walk on. I could see people walking by and seeing her feet sticking out of the bush and thinking, it's just a drunk. Because that was so common. Alcoholism, that was Portland back in the day. Everybody was an alcoholic. Old men, old women, young women. It didn't really matter. Rich, poor, fat, skinny, it did not matter. Everybody was an alcoholic in Portland. And there was always stories of people finding people passed out drunk in their front yards, or people found drunk, behind. But there's drunk people they would just drink to excess and then collapse somewhere. So I could see locals, at least a couple locals, walking by and seeing someone's feet sticking out of, or somebody just collapse in the brush and think, it's just a drunkard sleeping it off. Even though, well, I don't know, I was about to say, this woman was apparently refined looking, which might catch somebody's eye, but if she was mostly in the bushes and just kind of her feet sticking out, they might not see that part of her. So, I don't know, it's interesting to me that it took, because authorities felt that her body had been left there sometime in the night. So we went through the whole morning and half the afternoon almost before she was found, and it just seems to me somebody would have seen her, and that emergency bell in their head would have gone off, and they would have contacted somebody. It makes me wonder, was she really deposited there when people say, or was she deposited more closely to the time that this strange transient looking for work suddenly stumbles onto her? And it's because that method again, this guy may have absolutely nothing to do with the case. I'm just saying that the method has been used by criminals in the past that they kill somebody. Obviously, it's well known, well documented, that people who kill will sometimes, they'll show up at the memorial of the person that they killed. They will offer help in, searching for a missing person that they killed. They will get directly involved. It's part of that just sick, just disgusting, murderous ego. But beyond that, it was, it's been a method used by some that they'll kill somebody and then under, circumstances that they try to create and establish, they will kill the person and then deposit them somewhere, and then they'll be the ones that find them. Because, if someone is found in the brush in the middle of town, you're not going to, in the middle of an afternoon, people aren't really going to be suspicious of that person that finds the person. They're not going to be really suspicious that that person is a killer. They're going to think that's, that's part of the reason that method has been used by some. So if that was the case with this guy that found her, who again, God, I wish they would have posted his name. They posted the name of the construction worker he went and talked to. Maybe it was just that nobody actually got the guy's name, and I don't know if the guy, it seems like the guy was gone by the time the police showed up, which is another kind of red flag. But, could that maybe have been why in the days prior this guy kept showing up and asking for construction work? So that he would have a reason to be in that area. Oh, he's this guy that keeps coming around looking for work. So it would be understandable that another day on the construction site, this guy is going to show up and ask for work at some point. He starts walking towards the construction site and, oh, look at this, I found a body. It's possible. You are at risk. Obviously if it's the middle of the night and it's dark and everyone's in bed, it's a little easier to hide something and have no one see that it was you. It's a lot more risky when it's broad daylight and there's more people out. So I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm just saying it's very interesting, and it warrants this interesting individual that supposedly found the body of the Rose City Park victim is worth theorizing about. And here I am. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do this, was because I had to keep everything a lot more concise in that video. And, here I am. I'm speaking more freely about it. And so that's another reason I wanted to do this type of recording, was I knew I'd be able to go even more in depth into this thing, even though I haven't addressed it for a while, but I still remember the intimate details of the case. Now, back to Suzanne Queering. And here's another issue that was, this felt like one of those things where they were trying to adjust the story to be a certain way, but they missed a detail and it made everything not make sense. So, they claim that the Rose City victim is ultimately Suzanne Queering. A gun that was never seen in her hand suddenly is found in her hand, and she's found with 2 bullets that I think were wrapped in a handkerchief probably in the pocket of a coat or something. And so I want to say it was her uncle. She was living with someone who wasn't an immediate parent. I want to say it was her uncle. Anyway, this family member, he initially was I don't know how she got the bullets for this gun. It was a total mystery to him. Where did she get these bullets from? A 12-year-old girl wasn't going to, walk into a gun store and buy bullets for a gun. Even back then, I'm not sure that was even legal. And even if it did happen, the gun store owner would probably remember that and connect to that. So it was a mystery. How did she get this ammunition? And then right after that, suddenly it's reported, oh, well, this relative had a box of bullets, and conveniently, the box of bullets, 2 bullets were missing. So they said, there we go. That makes sense. She has 2 bullets on her person, 2 bullets missing from his box of bullets. But the problem with that is, in addition to the 2 bullets that she had on her person, she would have had to have had a 3rd bullet to actually shoot herself with. And we don't know, I don't remember if it actually said in any of the articles whether the gun had other rounds loaded into it, whether there was just one and the chamber was empty or whether there was other rounds in it. That would be good information to know. I don't think any of the newspapers that I read stated that about the gun. I don't remember them saying a whole lot of details about the weapon that was used, which would be an interesting detail to understand too, because, if somebody says, the bullets that were used to kill the Rose City Park victim were of this type and this caliber, and then suddenly Suzanne Queering, those details are different. She was killed by a different type of bullet, different caliber of bullet, different brand of bullet, a bullet that would have come from a completely different type of gun. All those details start coming out, and you have even more issues in this case in terms of trying to argue that these are the same people. So, because it felt so open and shut. They thought it was an unknown person, because that's happened. I found cases where literally it's a mystery. And then I do a little more digging later on, and I discover, there was actually this resolution that came along later. That happened with a murder video I did about a woman named Mary Spina, who, the first article I read about her, it said her name was Mary Espina. So I was looking up info on Mary Espina, and there was actually a lot of articles where that was the name given, and this was a young woman who, there was a guy who was boarding with her family, became obsessed with her. The father said, "You'll never be with my daughter, get the hell out of my house." He was literally, this guy was such a threat to Mary and her family that the local law enforcement told him he had to leave the state and never come back. So he left the state, and then he came back, spent a day asking around whether the Spina family was still living at the same house. Went to the house, opened Mary's window, and literally emptied his gun into her while she was asleep in bed. But I couldn't find any, it was just he did that, then he ran off, and we're looking for him. So there was no resolution to the video. Well, then I found out later on that her name wasn't Mary Espina, but Mary Spina. And I found more articles that showed that the guy that did it actually was busted later on. So I was able to find that resolution. Same thing recently happened with this case of this old dance hall up in the Albina area that's no longer there. And they found a construction crew doing renovation on the dance hall back in 1921. They were doing a bunch of renovation. They were in the basement, and this guy was digging a hole to put a jack into, and while he was digging, this earth out of the ground, they discovered some personal items and a bunch of bones, including a skull, buried down there. And authorities thought that and this is where my initial research ended, was authorities thought that there was this woman who lived not too far from Portland named Vera White, who had vanished around 1912, 1913. And they thought that she was this victim because with these remains, the only real piece of evidence they had to go on was there was a ring found with this victim that said Billy to Vera. And Vera White had a husband named Billy when she disappeared. However, the husband's version of Billy was spelled Billy, kind of the most common way. But the ring, the Billy was spelled Billie. So when I initially looked into it, I was kind of on the authorities' side. Yeah, it probably was Vera White that ended up there. But then I'm like, okay, well, they reached that conclusion for 2 reasons, really. One, that she did disappear. And 2, that she had a husband that matched, Vera and Billy. They matched the names on the ring, but the name was spelled differently on the ring. And over time, that became too much of an issue for me to avoid. They're not going to etch the wrong spelling of her husband's name into a ring. So it just seemed to me that was a convenience. And I came back and looked this story up again about a year after I first found it, and discovered that a a woman recognized the ring, and it had belonged to her sister, and it had ended up ultimately in the possession of another sister named Mabel Phillips, who disappeared from California in 1914. And so I actually was able to, go back and found out that they actually did ultimately find out who that victim was too. So this could have just been another one of those things where, because when I first looked this up, I just found a couple, 2 or 3 little nothing articles about this Rose City victim, and that was it. It was completely left in mystery. And it was just by chance that doing more research, I stumbled onto the Suzanne Queering thing and had no idea it was connected until I looked at it and realized, oh, this article's from 2 days later. And then I read one of these articles about Suzanne Queering, and they referenced, oh, this is this person who was, killed near 47th and Fremont, even though, again, one of the other earliest articles said it was on Knott. It was a mile away. So I only connected the two by chance. Absolute chance. But anyway, as I was saying, because I just went off on a tangent, I was discussing this issue with the bullets and how they determined, oh, well, we know Suzanne took bullets from her uncle's box of bullets because 2 bullets were missing and 2 bullets were found on her, but that doesn't account for the 3rd bullet that she would have had to shoot herself with. There would have had to be 3 bullets missing in that case. So that seemed like a situation where all of a sudden this relative's like, I don't know how she would get the bullets. I don't know how the questions started arising, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, no, he had bullets missing from his box. So let's not talk about that anymore. The issue's resolved. It's like, well, no, it's not. Because the number of bullets that should have been missing doesn't match what actually was missing. And that doesn't account for whether more bullets may have been taken to put into the gun. Again, was the chamber empty? Was there bullets in it? Was there bullets in it when she took the gun? Who knows? I mean, the fact that she actually would have gone and taken bullets out of a box leads me to think that the gun was probably not loaded. But that's a detail that is either unknown or I can't remember it. But I don't remember them giving a lot of details about the gun specifically. And so, in the end, they shifted. There was an absolute shift in the story. A 15 to 17-year-old refined-looking young woman with a skull fracture at Fremont and 47th turned into a 12-year-old with a gunshot wound in the head, a gun in her hand, bullets on her person, who was found potentially a mile away, who's only 12 years old, who committed suicide. How are those the same people? Again, even if maybe 1 or 2 little details were mistaken, how does a case completely shift like that, and yet in the end the authorities say, oh, these are the same 2 people? The Rose City Park victim that we couldn't identify was Suzanne Queering, because that is what they said in the end. And it's absolutely bizarre to me, and I'm actually glad that I could, because when I did that video, and again, I was trying to keep it concise, and I was still kind of memorizing the details as I was doing the video, so it was kind of a tight thing. And now here I am kind of just, reflecting on them and in a much more comfortable position because I'm not worried about getting all the specific details right, which in effect makes it easier to remember all the specific details. I'm amazed I remember this stuff as well as I do since I haven't looked at it since I did the video, 3 some months ago. But even at the time I was doing the video, I was wondering, is there enough here? Am I just... am I reading this the way, am I reading it the way that I want to read it? Because it makes for a fun, entertaining video. Did the police cover up a murder and claim it was the suicide of this girl? Oh, wow, what a scoop. And I did kind of wonder if maybe I was trying too hard to make it look like there was some kind of police conspiracy and covering up this case. Was I going too far with this? Was I not really, even though I was reading the details, just a small part of me felt like maybe I was pushing this. And then I posted the video and I got responses, and it was like a lot of people were in total agreement with me. And now that I'm out here more casually, more openly, more freely discussing the details, I'm 5 times as convinced now that there was some cover-up that happened than I was when I did. I was still pretty sure that that was where I was being led. There was just too many details that didn't match. And even then, I kind of tried to do it as a, hey, this is what they said happened. I wasn't saying like, this is what happened. There was a cover-up, and F you if you don't agree with me. I was saying like, I think something crooked happened here, and here's why. And even at the end of the video, I said, I think this is what happened. I never said, this is what happened, deal with it. But now I'm even more convinced that something weird went on, and either the police were, this was some refined girl. The police were worried that they, weren't going to be able to get the kid. I mean, that would be the motive. One, you get rid of a case. You get this case off your desk of this unsolved murder victim by just saying, oh, well, she was this other person. And boom, you make, one murder disappear by claiming it's a suicide of another person. It really wouldn't be that hard. And again, the Portland police were corrupt as hell back then. They would totally do something like this. So it gets rid of a case, but it also gets rid of a case that is potentially doomed to linger unsolved, because it seemed like they really had nothing to go on. They just found a dead woman in some bushes that had been beaten with some blunt instrument, but where were they going to go from there? Did they have any remote idea who the suspect might have been? So it didn't just get rid of a case that the police wouldn't have to deal with now, but it got rid of a case that may have become a thorn in their side and may have left, unsolved murders of young people in particular really get the public angry. Police, why aren't you doing more? And they don't want that. They don't want that blip on their reputation. So they make the Rose City case disappear by claiming this, high school aged girl was really this sixth grade aged girl who managed to change blunt force trauma, skull fractures into a gunshot wound with a gun she had in her hand, but the police never saw initially. It's just crazy. So yeah, I think even now more than before there was absolutely a cover up in this case, and that they made this Rose City victim disappear. I'd really like to look back, really dig into that period of time. I think it was February or March 1911, and see if there was any reports of missing people reporting daughters missing who were around that age, that were never found again, and think, maybe that was the Rose City murder victim that they just made disappear.